Hello, welcome to the world of Ikard, where we learn how to think like the College Board.
And if you can think like the College Board,
you can get a 5 on the AP exam.
My name is Mr. Ikard, I'm an AP World History teacher, and these are my students. And today's video is a special review lesson for Unit 2, Networks of Exchange. As always, we'll be using the CED as our guide. We'll begin with the historical thinking skill of comparison. And as always, we'll be using the 6 historical themes as our framework. And along the way, we're also going to be covering the other thinking skills of causation and continuity and change over time. Let's start with a comparison of our 3 main trade routes: Silk Roads, Indian Ocean, and Trans-Saharan. There are a lot of similarities in what the College Board wants you to know about them. First, we want to look at how technology influences economics. In all 3 of the topics, the College Board mentions how technological innovations led to an increased volume and also expanded the geographic range of trade. So this is a clear example of causation here. Technology is causing trade to do 2 things: increased volume, meaning more stuff is traded, and expanded geographic range, meaning that trade is happening in places farther away than before. So let's look at some of the technologies involved and see how they have an impact on trade. On the Silk Roads, we got caravanserai. These are kind of like rest stops, but on a bigger scale, where people can get supplies, rest their horses and camels. This helps increase trade because people can travel greater distances, and they can carry more stuff if they know that there will be safe places to keep it. On the Indian Ocean, you've got the compass. This helps you know which direction you're going. You've also got the astrolabe, which lets you know in which latitude you're on. If you've got both a compass and an astrolabe, you can know both where you are and where you're going, which is super important if you're traveling on the sea or anywhere for that matter. It's the closest thing to having Google Maps in the period 1200 to 1450. You've also got lateen sails, which allow you to sail against the wind, and stern rudders, which allow you to better steer your ship. All of these innovations make the sea easier to get around, and so people can more confidently sail to farther away places. Also, they made bigger ships. Obviously, you can put more stuff on bigger ships. On the Trans-Saharan trade routes, you've got caravans and the camel saddle. The Silk Roads also have caravans. Those are the groups of traveling merchants that stay at the caravanserai. And in both the Trans-Saharan and Silk Roads, you've also got the camel saddle. Is that for riding camels? Mainly the camel saddle is used for loading the camels with more stuff.
Like the straw that broke the camel's back.
Sure, but we care more about the gold on the camel's back.
Poor camels.
Yeah, gold is pretty heavy, but somebody's got to do it. That takes us to our next similarity for these trade routes. They're all involved in transporting luxury goods. What are luxury goods?
Fancy stuff for fancy folks.
Exactly. Trade is a big deal during this time and very important for Unit 2. But we're mostly talking about expensive things that only the elites of society can afford. The majority of what most people in the world consume is still produced locally during this time period. So what were the luxury goods on these places? Let's start with the Silk Roads.
Silk. Obviously silk, and also porcelain.
And what about the Indian Ocean?
Spices. And cotton.
Ivory.
Yes. Poor elephants.
What about the Trans-Sahara?
More ivory. Gold.
Lots and lots of gold. Speaking of gold, let's talk about money technology.
You mean paper money?
Right again. Paper money developed in China during the Song dynasty, and it was useful for merchants who didn't want to carry around a bunch of gold and silver. So that's also a technology that could increase the geographic range of trade. Other commercial technologies that facilitated trade were banking houses and bills of exchange. Banking houses developed in Europe during the 1300s. It's a place where you can keep your money safe, so a bank. You could present them with a bill of exchange, an official document that said that you could get money from there. So you could leave your gold and silver in one bank, then take your bill of exchange, and then go get that gold and silver back from the other bank. This is both convenient and safe, both of which facilitate an increase in trade. So we've looked at the causal relationship between technology and economics. What about the relationship between economics and governance? Well, that's something that all 3 of these trade routes have as well. The College Board wants us to know that both the Indian Ocean trade routes and the Silk Roads led to the growth of powerful trading cities. For example, the Central Asian cities of Kashgar and Samarkand on the Silk Roads, the Swahili coasts of Kilwa, Mogadishu, Mombasa, Malacca in Indonesia, Gujarat in India, all on the Indian Ocean. Trans-Saharan trade also leads to some nice cities too. Timbuktu in Mali, for instance. And it's not just cities that are getting rich on trade, whole states are as well. Of course, you gotta know about Mali. I mean, literally you have to know because it's in the required content section of the CED. Mali gets rich and powerful by controlling the lucrative gold trade along the Trans-Saharan trade routes. So rich, in fact, that its most famous leader, Mansa Musa, may indeed be the richest man in history. He brought so much gold with him on his Hajj to Mecca that he actually destabilized the economy of Egypt. We've also got the Sultanate of Malacca, and the name should tell you two things. One, it's in Malacca, which, if you remember from 1.3, is where the Srivijaya Empire used to be, and it's a perfect place for controlling the trade through the Indian Ocean, charging money for every ship that passes by. You can also see that it's a sultanate, so we could see that Islam has already taken a dominant role in Southeast Asia by 1200 to 1450. Speaking of Muslim states, how about the Swahili coast of East Africa? These are city-states on the Indian Ocean, mostly led by Muslim rulers. And like the other ones we've mentioned, they're big on trade. But it's not just Muslim states that are booming because of trade. Plenty of Hindu states are making bank as well. For example, Gujarat, which is one of the Hindu Rajput kingdoms that we learned about in 1.3. You should remember that these states both encourage and benefit from trade. This is a causation relationship that goes both ways. They encourage trade by building infrastructure, roads, canals, ports, legal codes and punishments against bandits and pirates, and through diplomacy with other states to build trade relationships. They benefit from trade most directly by taxing the profits on it, or sometimes having state monopolies on certain goods. For example, like Mali has with gold, or China has with silk and iron. In this period of 1200 to 1450, we've got the Song dynasty, which was less involved in the Silk Road than previous dynasties, but was still very much involved. But they were super big on Indian Ocean trade, exporting their silk and porcelain as well as their iron and steel products. Then of course you've got the Mongols. They supercharge trade on the Silk Roads. Finally, there's the Ming. In their early years, they also embrace expanding trade in the Indian Ocean, famously by sending Admiral Zheng He on an epic trade and tribute voyage, where he visited all the major regions involved in the Indian Ocean trade routes, exchanging gifts, bringing back exotic stuff, and getting lots of representatives to kowtow before the emperor. And he also fought pirates, a classic example of states providing security along trade routes, and thus encouraging more trade. Let's get back to the Mongols.
Yeah, let's talk about my boys.
Of the whole cast of characters in Unit 2, the Mongols are definitely the biggest stars. They make a big impact, for better or for worse. First thing we need to know about them is that they caused the end of a lot of states. Most famously, the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258 and the Song dynasty in 1269. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan, the Mongols built the largest land empire the world has ever seen. But it is only united while he's alive. When he dies, it fragments into many states, which we call khanates. In Persia, you have the Il Khanate, and in China, you have the Yuan dynasty, both founded by grandsons of Genghis. You've also got those other khanates, most famously the Golden Horde. Looking at these three different Mongol khanates and the impact that they have on the people there is a classic AP exercise in the history thinking process of comparison. Firstly, let's look at their level of political control. In the Yuan dynasty, the control is more direct. In many ways, they simply adapt the already long tradition of centralized rule and imperial bureaucracy. The Chinese Empire is just under new management again. The Mongols were mostly tolerant of local religious beliefs, especially Buddhism, and even adopted some Confucian beliefs and practices in their government administration. But there were some important changes. For example, the Mongols did not allow the ethnic Han Chinese to have high positions in government. Instead, they either employed Mongols or other foreigners from their vast empire. In Chinese history, the Yuan dynasty is often seen as a period of cultural decline. The least centralized of the three is the Golden Horde. They could have conquered Russia if they wanted to, probably, but instead they focused on the traditional Mongol tactics of raiding and collecting tribute. Of the three khanates we're looking at now, they maintain their cultural traditions and nomadic lifestyle more than any of the others. This is an important moment for Russian history, since the previous disunited princes became more united in their fights against the Mongols. The Ilkhanate in Persia is somewhere in between these two in terms of direct political control. The Mongols were definitely in charge here, but they were much more willing to allow the local Persian bureaucrats to administer the day-to-day affairs. The Mongols might have been most culturally changed in this Khanate. In fact, they even converted to Islam eventually. Now let's talk about the Mongols' economic effects. You should already be familiar with this, so let's pretend like we're doing a short answer question. Identify and explain the impact of states on economic development in the period 1200 to 1450. The Mongol Empire was a state that had a significant impact on economic development in the period 1200 to 1450. For example, they built and expanded infrastructure such as the Silk Roads, and also provided security to the merchants who traveled these trade routes. These actions encouraged trade by making trade journeys both safer and more convenient. Hey, nice job following the ACE format. What if we asked a similar question about technology and innovation? For example, identify and explain an example of a state facilitating a technological transfer.
Gunpowder was an example of a technological transfer facilitated by a state in the period 1200 to 1450. Gunpowder originated in the Song dynasty, but was adapted by the Mongols, who adapted the technology throughout their empire. Since this technology was adopted by people who fought the Mongols in places like the Middle East and Europe, this is an example of a technological transfer.
Wow, I didn't expect that from you.
What's that supposed to mean?
So we've covered the major trade routes and some of the major states on them. How about we look at some cultural consequences of interaction?
Great idea, Mr. Eichard.
We can also include some of the transfers from topic 2.2, the Mongols. These first two are about how Europe adopted other people's technologies. For example, the Hindu-Arabic numeral system and Greco-Roman philosophy. We can't really give the Mongols credit for that. It more has to do with interactions between European Christians and Muslims. This last one, though, is definitely about the Mongols. The Mongols used the Uyghur script to write their language because they didn't have their own written language before. All of these are examples of how interactions between different cultures leads to transfers, cultural or technological. Sometimes these interactions are violent, for example between the European Christians and Muslims in the Crusades, or between the Mongols and a lot of people. In 2.5 we see even more examples. So by this point your teacher and my channel has probably beaten to death the point that belief systems and religions spread on trade routes. Buddhism on the Silk Road, Islam on the Trans-Saharan, Buddhism and Hinduism on the Indian Ocean, Islam on the Indian Ocean. But just in case you missed it, we just said it again. The biggest winner in 1200 to 1450 is Islam. We've also got some travelers, Marco Polo, Ibn Battuta, and Marjorie Kemp. This is another opportunity for some comparison. Let's see if my students can help us with that. What's something they all have in common, other than traveling?
They all wrote books about their travels.
Yes, otherwise we wouldn't know anything about them. What is a cultural impact of their writing?
One impact was that the people who read their books were more informed and more interested in cultures other than their own. For example, Marco Polo's book was often the only book Europeans had read about life in China. The wealth and culture he described there encouraged many states to want to have greater trade with China.
Wow, you just did another SAQ.
I only think in SAQs and LAQs these days. One example of how I only think in SAQs is that yesterday...
Okay, that's enough for now, but you should also be thinking in terms of answering short answer questions, long essay questions, and document-based questions. Let's quickly look at some differences.
Ibn Battuta was a Muslim who traveled to places where there were other Muslims.
And Marco Polo was a Christian who visited lands where people followed Confucianism, Buddhism, and Islam.
Marjorie Kemp mostly stayed in Europe.
And our last bit from Unit 2 is about the environment. I like to call it the bubonic and bananas topic. Okay, let's quickly talk about the bananas part. Did you know that bananas originated in Southeast Asia, but were brought to Africa by Indonesian seafarers?
Now I do.
And since bananas are a calorie-rich food source, their introduction to Africa helped facilitate population growth.
Just like champa rice in China.
And citrus fruit like oranges also originated in Southeast Asia, but were spread throughout Dar al-Islam, all the way to Spain. But mostly we care about the spread of the bubonic plague, called the Black Death in Europe. This is a good opportunity for us to look at causation. What were the causes of the bubonic plague spreading?
Mongols.
Don't blame my boys for everything bad. I say it was trade.
But didn't we say that the Mongols facilitated trade on the Silk Roads? So if you're saying that it was trade that spread the plague, wouldn't you also say that it was the Mongols that facilitated the trade that spread the plague?
Yeah, I guess so. My boys.
Now that's what I call complex thinking. You're looking at multiple causes and also unintended consequences. If you do that enough, you might just get the complexity point on the LEQ.
Oh, can we please do an LEQ now, Mr. Eichard?
Great idea. Let's look at an LEQ from the 2019 exam. In the period 600 to 1450 CE, trade networks expanded and economic productive capacity increased. Technological innovations and transfers often contributed to this process. Develop an argument that evaluates the extent to which technological innovations or transfers led to increased economic growth in this period.
But Mr. Eichard, I thought AP World History Modern begins in 1200.
But that's okay. We can just pretend the prompt says 1200 to 1450. There's plenty of stuff from both Unit 1 and Unit 2 that you can put in here. Now that we got the time period down, we need to look at which historical themes we should focus on. Easy. Technology and economics. Now, this is a crucial step. What is the history thinking process? Which of the 3 C's are we looking at? Led to lets us know this is a clear-cut case of causation. Before you start writing, I'd recommend making a list of all the evidence you know about technological innovations leading to economic growth in the period 1200 to 1450. Let's see. Did we talk about how innovations lead to economic growth? Yes. As we mentioned at the beginning, it's a key part of all 3 of our major trade routes. So if you know your Unit 2 content, thinking of evidence should not be difficult. On the Silk Roads, we've got transportation innovations and commercial innovations, a whole bunch of transportation innovations on the Indian Ocean, and also transportation innovations on the Trans-Saharan. It's more than enough evidence right there to answer the prompt. Now, we don't just want to list evidence, we want to construct an argument that answers the prompt. That means we need to explain how these innovations led to economic growth. They led to economic growth by facilitating an increase in the volume of trade and the geographic range of trade. So I think now we're ready to start writing. Here's what a good first paragraph would look like. Most good AP essays will begin with about 3 good sentences of contextualization. Here you should list some historical developments that you know that are happening at the same time. So you can mention some things from Unit 2 that you happen to remember. Here's what I would do. Go ahead and start out by writing down the time period and then list things that are going on that you remember from that time period that are in some way related. Religion spreading works because we're talking about trade routes. Then here we mention the fall of old states and the rise of new states, and we also mention how they benefit from trade. Whenever possible, list specific historic examples. Here we've mentioned 4 states already, which is good. This is probably enough already. Now we add this sentence, which mentions the word context and lets the person grading the paper know you're probably wrapping up your contextualization and moving on to your thesis. For our thesis, it's always important to use the phrasing of the prompt. So we begin with in this period, and you can see how we have innovations and led to economic growth here. We also mentioned some specific examples just to be safe. Too much detail will never harm you. Don't forget to write how this process occurs. That's what we call a line of reasoning. So you see we have here, by facilitating the increase in the volume and an increase in the geographic range. And we just took these phrases straight out of the CED.
That's thinking like the College Board.
So we're keeping it simple and making the first body paragraph about transportation innovation. The topic sentence here lets us know that, and also reiterates how these innovations led to economic growth. Body paragraphs are kind of like the short answer questions. You then also want to cite evidence and explain how the evidence answers the prompt. We just want to do the evidence and explain steps at least twice per paragraph. So in these sentences, we are describing the innovations, compass, astrolabe, and larger ship designs. Then in these sentences, we're explaining how that helps to increase trade. In this last sentence, we're hammering home the point about how increased trade leads to economic growth, so that the person grading the essay can see you are following through with your argument. This next paragraph is about commercial innovations. It's going to follow the exact same structure as the one before it. Clear topic sentence here that stays on track with our argument. We've got 2 specific examples of evidence here, and each of those is followed by explanation of how that helps merchants. And this last sentence reminds the grader that more trade means more economic growth. Now, what about that last point, the complexity point? The most difficult, elusive point. First off, I wouldn't worry about it too much. Just like Mr. Heimler says, don't worry about that point unless you've already been getting the other 5 points. But I'll go ahead and explain to you how you would get the complexity point on this particular essay. You see, there's many different ways that you can get complexity. Since this is a causation essay, we're going to look at this one, multiple causes and effects. So we're going to go ahead and add a paragraph about something that caused economic growth that wasn't related to technology. Can you think of any?
Oh yeah, the Mongols using their military power to defend trade routes helps trade. And that's not really a technological innovation.
Exactly. So that's a good piece of evidence, but we need a bit more. It's about a state, so that means we're talking about political stuff. What are some other political factors? What about security? The Mongols are also fighting bandits on the Silk Roads, which helps trade. Mali is probably doing that too. What else are they doing? They're building roads and stuff. Infrastructure. And hey, now I remember something from Unit 1. The Song Dynasty was super big on infrastructure. The Grand Canal. And speaking of China, I also remembered that Zheng He fought pirates. That's another state. The Ming. So now we've got the evidence, and we're just going to rinse and repeat the same structure as our other paragraphs for the most part. Topic sentence, evidence, explanation, analysis. And maybe you want to leave some space at the end of your thesis statement so you can add a bit there and make a complex thesis. And thus ends the Unit 2 review. We've covered all major content and skills that you need, as well as some useful exam practice.
You give us all the guidance we need, Mr. Eichert.
If you have any questions about anything, feel free to leave a comment below. And if you found this video useful, then please subscribe. And I'll see you in the next one.